I went still the moment I heard the voice coming from my own kitchen. "Margaret, we told you don't touch what's in the left cabinet. That's for when my parents visit this weekend." I was standing at the counter I had stood at for 22 years. The cabinet she was referring to was the one my late husband Robert had built himself the summer before our son was born, and my daughter-in-law was telling me not to open it. I set down my coffee mug slowly. I breathed. I said nothing. That was the moment I realized I had made the worst mistake of my life, and that I was going to have to be very careful and very patient about how I undid it. My name is Margaret. I am 64 years old. I taught third grade for 31 years at an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio. I raised one son, Daniel, mostly on my own after his father, Robert, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's when Daniel was 12. Robert passed 3 years ago, quietly, on a Tuesday morning in October, in the bedroom upstairs where we had slept together for 34 years. I held his hand. I stayed until the room went still. After Robert died, I rattled around this house alone. 4 bedrooms, a yard that felt too large, a kitchen table with 3 chairs. I never moved because moving them felt like admitting something. My sister lived in Phoenix. My closest friends had retired and scattered. Daniel called every Sunday, and sometimes on Wednesdays, and I told him everything was fine because I did not want to be a burden, and because I believed, for a while, that it was true. It was Daniel who suggested moving in. He called it temporary. He used the word transition. He and Serena had been renting an apartment in Cincinnati, and he had just lost his position at the logistics company where he had worked for 6 years. Budget cuts, he said. Nothing he did wrong. Serena worked in marketing, but her income alone was not enough for their rent. They needed 6 months, maybe 8. Just until Daniel found something new. I said yes without hesitation. He was my son. The house had 3 empty bedrooms. I had sat alone at that kitchen table for 3 years, and I missed the sound of other people living around me. I thought of Sunday dinners, and the smell of someone else's coffee brewing, and the ordinary comfort of a light on in another room. I said yes, and I meant it genuinely, and I was glad. They arrived on a Saturday in March with a moving truck that was larger than I had expected. The first weeks were fine, or close to fine. Serena cooked sometimes, and I cooked sometimes, and we ate together most evenings. Daniel was attentive, helpful, cheerful in the way he had always been when he wanted something to work. He fixed the gutter at the back of the house and repainted the mailbox post, and I felt useful having them there. I felt like the house was alive again. The changes came slowly. Small things first, the kind you dismiss individually because none of them seem worth making an issue over. Serena rearranged the living room furniture without asking. I came home from my book club one Thursday evening, and the sofa was against the wrong wall, and the armchair where I had always sat was pushed into the corner. When I mentioned it, she said she thought the new arrangement gave more natural light. I moved my armchair back. The following week it was in the corner again. She began buying groceries and storing them in specific places and making clear, without exactly saying so, that certain things were hers and certain things were mine. The left cabinet, the bottom shelf of the refrigerator, the good skillet I had received as a wedding gift was moved to a high shelf I could not easily reach, and a new pan appeared on the hook where mine had hung. I told myself these were adjustments, 2 households learning to share a space. I had asked them to move in. I reminded myself of that when I felt the tightening in my chest that came when Serena spoke to me in the particular tone she used, the tone that was technically polite but carried something underneath it, something that said, "You are in the way." 6 months passed. Then 8. Daniel had interviews, he said, several promising leads. The timeline extended itself quietly, without discussion, until I realized one morning that I had stopped asking when they planned to leave, because asking felt rude, and because I was no longer certain they would. It was around the 11-month mark when Daniel raised the subject of the deed. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. Just the 2 of us. Serena had gone to bed early. Daniel poured himself another glass of wine, and he was warm and easy the way he was when he was building towards something, and he talked for a few minutes about how much they appreciated being there and how settled they had started to feel. And then he said it. He said that a colleague of his, a guy he had done some consulting work with, had mentioned that it might make sense, from an estate planning perspective, for Daniel to be added to the deed of the house, just so that when the time came, the house would pass directly to him without going through probate. It would save time and legal fees, he said. It was very common, he said. His colleagues' parents had done the same thing. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a document, already prepared, with fields for my signature. I looked at it. I looked at him. I did not sign it that night. I told him I wanted to read it carefully. He said, of course. No rush, whenever I was comfortable. He topped off his wine and changed the subject to a baseball game, and the conversation moved on, and I sat with that folder in my hands and felt, for the first time, something I could not quite name. Not alarm, not yet. Something quieter and colder. A question mark I did not want to look at directly. I read the document upstairs that night. It was a deed transfer, adding Daniel as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. That meant if I died, the house became his automatically. It also meant that as a joint tenant, he would have equal legal ownership of the property while I was still alive. I put the document in my nightstand drawer, and I lay awake for a long time. I want to be honest about why I signed it 3 weeks later, because I think it matters. And because when I tell this story, I do not want anyone to think I was foolish without understanding why. I signed it because Daniel was my son, and I had raised him, and I trusted him in the deep, pre-rational way that parents trust their children, the way that bypasses logic because it is built from 38 years of knowing someone's face. I signed it because he sat with me on the porch one evening and talked about Robert, about how much he missed his father, about how he wanted to take care of me the way his father had, and I cried and he held my hand, and the moment felt real and true, and I believed it. I signed it because I was 63 years old, and I had been alone for 3 years, and my son was sitting in my house, and I wanted, more than I had allowed myself to admit, to believe that everything was going to be all right. I signed it on a Wednesday afternoon. Daniel took the document and said he would file it. He thanked me and hugged me, and that evening Serena made pasta for dinner, and she was warm in a way she had not been in months, and I told myself I had done the right thing. 4 months later, Daniel came to me with another proposal. He sat me down at the kitchen table again. The same chair, the same folder on the table motion that I now recognized but could not yet name for what it was. He explained that the house needed significant repairs. The roof was aging, the basement had some water intrusion issues that he had been monitoring, the HVAC system was old. He had gotten quotes, he said. The total came to roughly $60,000, maybe a bit more. He said that since he was now on the deed, they could refinance the house together, pull out equity, handle the repairs properly, and build in some extra cushion for future maintenance. The house was worth approximately $280,000 and was fully paid off. A $60,000 cash-out refinance would be straightforward, he said. He would handle all the paperwork. I just needed to sign. I asked to see the contractor quotes. He said he had them on his laptop and he would email them to me. He never did. I asked again a week later. He said he was waiting on the third quote to come in. I said I would like to choose the contractors myself, or at least be involved. He said, of course, absolutely. Let's sit down and go over everything together. We never did. The loan documents arrived by mail, and Daniel sat with me at the table and walked through them page by page, quickly, and I felt the familiar pressure of his presence beside me, and his explanations coming faster than I could process, and the pen being placed in my hand at each signature line. I signed. I do not say that to excuse myself. I say it because I need you to understand how it happens, not in a dramatic moment of coercion, but in the accumulation of small normalizations, each one following from the last, until you are signing documents at your own kitchen table that you do not fully understand because the person beside you is your child, and you have spent your whole life trusting him. The $60,000 was deposited into a joint account that Daniel set up, with both our names on it. Within 3 months, it was gone. I found out by accident. I had needed to call the bank about an unrelated matter, a small discrepancy on my personal checking account, and the representative mentioned in passing that the balance on the joint account was currently $412. I asked her to repeat that. She did. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the bank for 40 minutes, then I drove home. I did not confront Daniel immediately. This is the part of the story where people ask why, where they feel frustrated with me, and I understand that frustration. I want to explain it. I was afraid. Not physically, I was never physically afraid of my son. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid that there was an explanation I had not considered, that the money had gone towards something I had forgotten or misunderstood, that I would accuse my son of something terrible and discover I was mistaken and lose him entirely over my own confusion. I was 63 years old, and I had just added my son to the deed of my house and refinanced my paid-off mortgage, and I was terrified of what it would mean if I looked at those facts clearly and saw what they were. So instead, I asked quietly. I mentioned that I had called the bank and that I was surprised by the balance, and could he walk me through what the funds had been used for? He was calm. He said the contractors had been paid, most of it in cash, because they gave a cash discount, and that there had been some supply delays, so a couple of the projects were still outstanding. He said he had receipts somewhere. He would find them. He never found them. I waited 2 more weeks. I requested bank statements directly from the bank, which I was entitled to do because my name was on the account. I sat at the kitchen table after Daniel and Serena had gone to bed, and I went through every transaction line by line with a yellow legal pad beside me. There were no contractor payments. There were transfers to an account I did not recognize. There were withdrawals at ATMs in Cincinnati, where they had friends, where Serena's sister lived. There was a charge from a luxury car dealership for a down payment. There was a hotel in Nashville for 4 nights. There were transfers that happened in clusters, quickly, as if someone had been moving money before it could be examined. I put the statements in an envelope. I put the envelope in my tote bag. I went upstairs, and I lay in the dark in the bedroom where Robert had died, and I looked at the ceiling, and I allowed myself, finally, to understand what had happened. I cried, not for long. I had work to do. The next morning, while Daniel and Serena were both at work, I called an elder law attorney whose name had been given to me years ago by a colleague of mine who had dealt with a similar situation in her own family. Her name was Patricia Wells, and she had an office on the east side of Columbus. I told her secretary it was urgent. I met with Patricia 3 days later. I brought the bank statements, the deed transfer, the refinance documents, and a notebook where I had written down a timeline of events from the day Daniel and Serena had moved in. Patricia read everything carefully and said very little while I talked. When I finished, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You were defrauded. This is financial elder abuse, and we can fix this." I retained her with a check for $4,000, which was most of what I had in my personal checking account at that moment. She told me that if we prevailed, the court could order Daniel to pay my legal fees. I nodded, and I wrote the check, and my hand was steady. Patricia moved quickly. She filed for an emergency motion to have Daniel's name removed from the deed on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, meaning he had obtained my signature through deception. She simultaneously filed a civil claim for the $60,000 in missing funds. I still had to live in the house while this was happening. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the hardest part of this story to describe. I came home from Patricia's office, and I sat in my armchair, which Serena had moved to the corner again, and I listened to the 2 of them making dinner in my kitchen and laughing at something on Serena's phone, and I was completely calm in a way that surprised me. Something had clarified. I knew what was true. I had told someone with the power to help, and now I simply had to wait and be careful. I did not tell Daniel what I had done. Patricia advised against it. I lived in my house, and I ate my meals, and I answered their questions when they spoke to me, and I gave nothing away. There were moments that were harder than others. One evening, Serena told me that I should think about moving my things out of the main bathroom because her parents would be visiting, and it would be more comfortable if they had their own space. And I looked at her, and smiled, and said I would give it some thought. Inside, I was a stone. The papers were served on a Thursday morning when I was out buying groceries on purpose. Patricia had told me the approximate time. I drove around for an hour. When I came home, Daniel's car was in the driveway, but the house was very quiet. He found me in the kitchen. His face was different than I had ever seen. It stripped of the ease and warmth he had always worn with me, showing something harder underneath. He asked me what I was doing. He said this was insane. He said I had agreed to everything voluntarily, and I had never objected. He said I was going to tear the family apart. I had thought about what I would say when this moment came. I had rehearsed it standing at the bathroom sink at 2 a.m. I said, "Daniel, I paid off this house. Your father and I spent 20 years paying off this house. I raised you in this house. I welcomed you into this house because you needed help, and I love you. and you took the equity from this house and spent it, and I have the bank records to prove it." I paused. "I hope you find a good attorney." Then I took my grocery bags, and I put my things away in my kitchen, and he stood there for a moment, and then he left the room. The legal process took 7 months. I will not pretend they were easy months. There were evenings when I second-guessed myself, when I lay awake and asked whether there had been a moment where I could have handled things differently, some earlier version of the conversation that would have gone another way. There were moments when I missed my son, not the son who had sat at my table with a folder of documents, but the child he had been, the teenager who had cried at his father's first hospital stay, the young man who had driven 12 hours to be with me on the day Robert died. I grieved that loss, which was a different grief than any I had experienced before, because the person was still alive. Daniel and Serena moved out 6 weeks after being served, when it became clear the case was not going to disappear. The house felt different after they left, not quiet in the old lonely way, but still in the way of reclaimed space, of rooms returning to themselves. Patricia was as good as she had promised. The judge found that Daniel had obtained my signature on the deed transfer through misrepresentation and ordered his name removed. On the civil claim, the court found sufficient evidence of misuse of funds and ordered Daniel to repay the $60,000 plus my legal fees, which totaled $11,200. He had 90 days to begin payment, structured over a repayment schedule. The first check arrived in a plain envelope with no note. I deposited it, and I sat for a minute in my car outside the bank, in the same parking lot where I had sat 7 months earlier, learning that the money was gone. The difference between those 2 moments, I cannot fully explain it. I will just say that I sat there a long time, and I was not crying. I used the repayments, as they came in, carefully. I hired a real contractor, one I found myself, after asking 3 neighbors and checking online reviews to address the roof and the basement, which did genuinely have some issues. The actual repair cost was $22,000, not $60,000. I had the work done properly, and I watched it being done, and I asked questions, and I understood exactly what I was paying for. With the remaining funds, I set up a separate account in my name only. I consulted with a fee-only financial advisor, someone Patricia recommended, about how to structure my finances going forward. I updated my will. I had a conversation with my sister in Phoenix that I had been putting off for years. The kind of honest conversation about money and plans and expectations that I had always avoided because it felt uncomfortable, and which turned out to be one of the most relieving conversations of my life. I refinished the hardwood floors in the front hallway, something I had wanted to do for years but had never gotten to. I bought new curtains for the living room. I moved my armchair back to the window where it had always belonged, where the morning light comes through at an angle that is exactly right, and I have not moved it since. My relationship with Daniel is complicated, and I will not pretend otherwise. He did not contest the judgment, which his attorney apparently advised against given the bank records. He made payments on schedule, which I believe was also legally advised. We have spoken twice since the case concluded, short, careful conversations that were not warm but were not hostile. He has not apologized in any form that felt genuine, and I have stopped waiting for one. That particular grief lives in its own compartment now. Somewhere I can acknowledge it without letting it run the rest of my life. What I have learned, and what I believe with more certainty than almost anything else, is this. No matter how much you love someone, no matter how long you have known them, or how completely you trust them, your name belongs on every document that involves your money or your property. Not as a failure of love, not as a signal of distrust, as a basic fact of your own life and your own future. The deed to your house should have your name on it because it is your house. The account should have your name on it because it is your money. Love does not require you to erase yourself from your own assets. And if someone you love tells you that it does, that is the moment to pay very close attention. I am 64 years old. I own my home outright again. I make coffee in the morning, and I sit in my armchair by the window, and I read before the day begins. My neighbor Carol and I have started walking on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, a route that takes us past the park and back, about 40 minutes. Last spring, I started volunteering at the elementary school, 2 afternoons a week, helping 3rd graders with reading the same grade I taught for 3 decades, the same age, where you can see a child's relationship with language forming in real time, where a book can become a door. I am not angry, most of the time. I am something else more clear-eyed than I was before, more attentive to the difference between love and habit, between trust and assumption. I am kinder to myself than I used to be, more patient with the woman who signed those documents because she wanted her son to stay and because she did not yet know how strong she was. The house is mine. The morning light is mine. The armchair by the window is exactly where it belongs. If you are watching this and something in this story felt familiar, a document placed in front of you too quickly, an explanation given too fast for you to follow, a voice in your own home that made you feel like a guest, please hear me when I say, that feeling you are trying not to look at directly is worth looking at. There are people who can help you. There are attorneys who specialize in exactly this. You are not being dramatic. You are not being disloyal. You are not tearing the family apart. The family was already being taken apart, piece by piece, and you simply have not yet decided to stop it. You can decide to stop it? I did. If this story reached you at the right moment, I hope you will share it with someone who needs it. And if you have been through something similar, if you have sat in a parking lot looking at a bank balance that told you what you did not want to know, I want you to know that the other side of that moment exists, that you can reach it, that the armchair can go back by the window. It took me longer than it should have, but I got there.